Right, let's jump straight into this explainer by tackling a super common, deeply ingrained narrative. We've all heard it, the idea that simply sending money is the ultimate fail-safe solution to global poverty. For decades now, the West's go-to answer for economic struggles in developing nations has been pretty straightforward. Just send more cash. But as I was digging through the data for today's explainer, I actually stumbled upon a paradox that completely turns everything we think we know about charity, development, and economics totally upside down. To really grasp the sheer scale of this, over the last 50 years alone, over $1.2 trillion of foreign aid has been poured into Africa. I mean, let that sink in for a second. That is a truly staggering amount of money. To put it into perspective, it represents more wealth than the entire gross domestic product of developed, wealthy nations like Spain, Australia, or South Korea. You'd naturally assume an investment of that magnitude would just entirely eradicate poverty, right? Well, here is the absolute paradox. Despite this massive, literally unprecedented injection of cash, poverty actually skyrocketed. Before these massive aid programs even began, just 11% of the continent lived in extreme poverty. But by the 1990s, after absolute floods of money came in, that number had surged to a peak of 66%. And today, it stands at 38%. That's still well over 3 times higher than when the aid programs started. So what exactly went wrong? Let's move to part 1, the Marshall Plan myth, and why the West thought this would work in the first place. To understand this staggering humanitarian failure, we really have to look back at the ultimate success story of foreign intervention, the Marshall Plan. Facing a completely decimated Europe and the looming threat of communism after World War II, the United States pumped $13 billion, which is roughly $160 billion in today's money, into Europe between 1948 and 1952. And the results? They were spectacular. It kickstarted massive investment, and in the decade that followed, GDP per capita across Western Europe grew by almost 35%. It worked flawlessly. Thinking they had discovered a magic bullet for economic growth, Western nations looked to Africa. They figured they could just repeat this success. Aid to sub-Saharan Africa multiplied from $500 million a year in the 1960s to nearly $20 billion by the 1990s. That is a 40-fold increase. Yet inexplicably, from 1970 to 2000, average African incomes actually declined. The money went way up, but the prosperity went down. But despite the data glaringly showing a decline in income, the strategy didn't change at all. Instead, the West doubled down. Public campaigns, you probably remember Live Aid in the 80s, along with the UN's Millennium Development Goals, really cemented this powerful emotional narrative in our public consciousness. The idea was that poverty wasn't about complex politics, bad governance, or corruption. No, it was simply a lack of cash that your charity donation could magically fix. Which brings us to part 2, the root cause: extractive institutions. So why did the exact same strategy that saved Europe fail so spectacularly in Africa? Well, the answer lies in what economists call institutions. These are essentially the frameworks that govern societies. We're talking the rule of law, property rights, functioning ministries, and taxation systems. When the Marshall Plan began, Europe, even though it was physically destroyed by war, still possessed these vital institutional frameworks. They already had the systems in place to effectively absorb the cash, collect taxes, and rebuild from the ground up. In stark contrast, when African nations gained independence, they didn't have these inclusive systems. Instead, they inherited colonial-era administrations, and these inherited institutions were generally designed for one primary purpose: to extract wealth from the population to serve a ruling elite, rather than to actually serve the public good. As you can guess, pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into these extractive frameworks is an absolute recipe for disaster. This leads us to a staggering figure. The continent loses an estimated $30 billion every single year to corruption. Instead of funding roads, schools, and hospitals, aid money often directly funds the lavish lifestyles of ruling elites. I mean, we're talking private jets to international conferences and $60,000 Rolex watches worn by officials at literal anti-poverty summits. And that flows right into part 3, the accountability crisis, a completely broken feedback loop. You see, beyond just the financial waste, foreign aid severs a totally vital relationship. Think about how a normal, functioning democracy works. It relies on a very specific feedback loop. Citizens pay their hard-earned money in taxes, and in return, they expect public services like infrastructure, healthcare, and education. If the government fails to provide those services, the citizens use their voting power to demand a new government. The leaders are held directly accountable by the very people funding them. But in highly aid-dependent states, this mechanism is entirely broken. Take Malawi in the early 2010s, where foreign aid made up more than 40% of the national budget. Corrupt officials siphoned off millions, but they faced virtually zero domestic resistance. Why? Well, because their funding came from foreign donors, not domestic taxpayers. The citizens had absolutely no financial leverage to demand systemic change, which basically left them powerless.
Now, let's look at part 4, local industry collapse, the economic trap.
So we know aid insulates corrupt governments. But what does it actually do to the local economy? Consider the textile industry. We often think donating our old clothes is a really great way to help out, right? But in Ghana alone, over 80% of domestic textile factories were forced to shut down between 1990 and 2010. They simply couldn't compete with a massive flood of cheap, foreign-donated clothing. It completely wiped out local businesses and the jobs they provided. And this isn't just an isolated incident in Ghana. Across the board, Africa's industrial sector has actually shrunk over the last 2 decades, dropping from 15% of the continent's economy to just 10%. Even the World Bank found that periods of increased aid tend to actively weaken local manufacturing. It basically devastates the localized knowledge, machinery, and business networks required to build homegrown industries. This highlights a massive missed opportunity, especially when we compare it to how other nations escaped poverty. Countries like South Korea, Taiwan, and China grew rich through an export-led model. They offered low-cost goods to the global market, maintained a weak local currency to keep their exports super attractive, and then used that foreign demand to build massive domestic industries from the ground up. But heavy foreign aid creates what economists call the currency trap. When massive amounts of foreign aid flow into a country, all that money has to be converted into the local currency to be spent. This huge demand drives up the value of the local currency. Suddenly, that country's goods are way too expensive for foreign buyers. It completely destroys the export-led model that worked so perfectly in Asia, keeping African economies uncompetitive globally. Which leads us to part 5, the reality of aid projects, the staggering waste. Now, you might be thinking, okay, the macroeconomics are flawed, but surely the specific, targeted aid projects are doing some good, right? Unfortunately, a really comprehensive 2012 report by the Center for Global Development painted a pretty grim picture. They found that up to 70% of aid projects, yes, 70%, either failed entirely to meet their targets or had absolutely zero measurable impact. That is just a staggering rate of failure for a trillion-dollar endeavor. To give you some context, in Uganda, an audit found nearly a third of all donated medical supplies were lost, theft, mismanagement, or bad logistics before ever reaching a single patient. In Haiti, following the devastating 2010 earthquake, billions flowed in, yet less than 10% actually reached local institutions. Because these contractors answer to foreign donors in Geneva or Washington, rather than the local people actually using the services, there is just no real mechanism to punish this level of failure. And finally, part 6, trade over aid, why we need a new paradigm. Here is the big takeaway from all of this. While short-term emergency relief during sudden crises is absolutely vital, infinite foreign aid has simply not delivered sustainable growth. Instead, developing nations need to build strong, inclusive local institutions. They need to protect and support homegrown businesses rather than outcompeting them with charity. They must foster systems where governments are financially accountable to their own taxpayers, and they really need to pivot toward competitive, export-led global trade. Which leaves us with a final, pretty difficult question to ponder today. To truly help developing nations escape the grip of poverty, are we ready to abandon a trillion-dollar charity model that eases our conscience, but actively breaks their economies? Is it time we stop just giving and finally start trading as equal economic partners? Let that sink in, and, as always, keep questioning the consensus.